This is Michael Monroe. I'm on the music faculty of Gordon College here in Wyndham, Massachusetts, and this is the first audio podcast that I've done on my blog, MMmusing, and I'm thrilled to have as my first guest a very distinguished pianist and distinguished colleague of mine, Dr. Mia Chung. Welcome, Mia.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
I thought an interesting way to frame this discussion is to notice that we are colleagues, and Mia's a pianist, I'm a pianist, we both teach piano here. But she's going to be playing the Brahms Second Piano Concerto in a little less than 2 weeks, and I will not be, and I will probably never play this piece. And so I mentioned that as a way of saying that this is just a monumentally challenging work, and so I wonder if, to start off, if you could just talk a little bit about your decision to perform it, just the overall reputation of the piece, how you came to decide to perform this piece. Is this your first time playing it?
This is my first time, yes. I'm in the process of learning it right now. Over the past couple months, I've been really, actually since mid-March. I started learning the piece in January. Spent several weeks over break doing that, sort of uploading the information into my brain about structure and key areas and phrases, and then I had several recitals to do in February and March. So it was mid-March that I had the time finally to start really getting it into my fingers.
Wow, that's a pretty tight window.
It's a tight window and not an ideal window in some ways, but I have to say the writing is so clearly thought out and presented and structured, such that Brahms made my job a little bit easier in some ways because of the classical influence. But you're right. I mean, it is a titanic work. It's the kind of work that one plays sort of at the end of their life, much in the way that the Hammerklavier or the Goldberg Variations is seen as a kind of Mount Everest for pianists.
Right.
I would say that this is probably that for one of the concerti that has that distinction for pianists.
So what's been your relationship to the piece? Have you been looking at it from afar, thinking about playing it for a long time, or
yes.
how did you come to that decision?
Actually, it's funny. My first encounter with this piece was when I was 15 or 16 in terms of listening. And it so happened that my teacher at that time, her name was Ilana Vered, she's an Israeli pianist, was on the faculty at Rutgers University for a long time. Fabulous pianist. An Israeli colleague of my mother's, she's a scientist, presented me with a recording of the second Brahms Piano Concerto that Ilana Vered had done. And I listened to it, and I actually fell asleep during the course of it. Because, I mean, as a 15-year-old, 16-year-old, I obviously wasn't mature enough to really appreciate the piece and what it had.
It's an interesting piece because it's virtuosic and difficult.
Yes.
Not as obviously flashy.
That's right.
As, say, Rachmaninoff concertos.
That's absolutely right. And so, at the time when I was a kid, of course, I was playing Tchaikovsky concerto and, Rachmaninoff concertos and other things like that, of that nature, and that was on the right wavelength for me at that point as a pianist and musician. But I always saw this as a work that I wanted to tackle at some point in my life, and I was afraid to for many years. And in fact, I went back and forth on this, when Jamie Buswell, who's the conductor of the Gordon Symphony Orchestra, asked me to do a concerto. I originally said the first Brahms Piano Concerto.
Have you played that before?
I have never performed it, but I'd studied it, and it's a piece that's very near and dear to me. And I had also thought about Prokofiev 3, which is quite a departure. But I realized that I needed to face my fears, and so one of my students actually said, "Oh, come on, Dr. Chung, why don't you just,
Good for students.
Yeah, right." And I said, "You're right. Okay, I'm not going to give myself the easy way out here. I'll embark on this." And what I realized was that after I was able to overcome the intimidation factor, I just totally fell in love with this piece. I mean, it is definitely my favorite piano concerto of all time.
Wow. And that's more just since you started learning it that you
Yes,
come to
absolutely.
That?
I mean, I think in some ways there's a slight inaccessibility to this piece if you are just listening to it. It's when you start to play it that you see a kind of narrative unfolding in the sequence of the four movements and an appreciation for who he is as a symphonic writer. I mean, pianistically speaking, it is tough, but it is not tough in the traditional sense of tough. In other words, it's not because there's lots of little runs and the velocity, virtuosity that we associate with concertos like that of
Chopin,
Liszt or Chopin or Rachmaninoff or even Beethoven, for example. But what you do have that's extremely challenging here is a use of register that is a very disparate one, first of all. And he conceives of piano writing in a very symphonic way. It is a symphonic piece. It's 4 movements. And how many piano concertos do you know of that are 4 movements?
Right.
Most of them are 3, right? So he's in some ways looking at the piano through the lens of the symphony.
Right. Yeah, 3 is a more sort of natural, dramatic kind of fast, slow, fast, and
absolutely.
So the scope of this is quite different.
Right, and so in some ways, in terms of a narrative, you see a much more epic journey that's traversed through the 4 movements, but also the possibility for even more contrast. As you add a 4th movement to it, then you have a new palette or emotion, that's plunked down into the mix of the standard 3-movement fast, slow, fast. And even within the fast, slow, fast of 3 movements, you have this, usually in the classical approach, substantial first movement, right? Sonata style first movement, an expressive slow movement that's melodically often very beautiful, almost as a reprieve or a contrast to the first movement, and then a lighthearted rondo fast movement, right? That sort of wraps things up in a jovial manner, and that's sort of the classical conception of the concerto. And this has elements of that. Certainly the large, substantial first movement, the slow 3rd movement, and then the rondo, light and upbeat 4th movement. But that it has injected into the middle of that this very sort of stormy, passionate 2nd movement. And so I've had to find a kind of emotional logic to this expanse.
Yeah, that's something I was going to ask you about in listening to it, because I agree there's a lot of playful musical material, but it's always on such an epic sort of scale.
Yes,
absolutely. With these even so, the last movement, for example, as you said, very lighthearted, but it doesn't feel lighthearted.
Not at all.
To sit down and play it.
It doesn't.
Do you think that's partially just because he's trying to have the piano be on a scale with the orchestra? Because the orchestra by Brahms' time is pretty large.
Pretty large, yeah. I do think that does contribute to the way he thinks. However, if I look at all of his piano writing, there's a certain sort of undercurrent through all of it, and that is this awkwardness, right, of combining thirds, running thirds and sixths, parallel thirds and sixths, spread over a very vast range of the keyboard. I mean, that seems to be a part of his writing all the way through. It's just, so I've always wondered, what were his hands like? And what kind of a pianist was he? I mean, apparently he didn't have huge hands, but he was a man of some size, right, considerable size, and there was perhaps some girth in the middle there, right? So in order to sort of straddle that, who knows, maybe that's what pushed the writing to the outer reaches of the keyboard. I don't know, but there are a couple things that do inform his love of these parallel thirds and sixths. He loved music of the Renaissance, for example, and this technique of faux bourdon, of parallel thirds and sixths was something that always informed, the counterpoint and polyphony of the Renaissance period and the Baroque era, right? Were definitely things that contributed to his thinking. So that has stuck with him all the way through, and you see that in huge scale in this piece. I mean, double third scales that run all the way up.
I saw those this morning.
Yeah, lovely, just delightful for every pianist. And then, sections where you have parallel octaves, spread out and jumping all over the place with the legato phrase marking over that, right? Incredibly difficult to do. And you hear some recordings, they just play it staccato, because it's at a speed where it's so difficult. So you do wonder, like, what was in the mind of this man, and what was he capable of doing pianistically that it
must have been a colossal technique.
Amazing.